Okay, I hope everyone can see my slides and I'm good to go. So, in his recent essay, Play for Today at 50, John Hill highlights the series' sustained effort to extend dramatic representation beyond England. While not quite at Barnett formula levels, Scottish work did indeed constitute a numerically significant and chronologically consistent thread throughout the series' history, featuring, for example, in both its first season in 1971, James McTaggart's Orkney, and its final one in 1984, Lawrence Moody's It Could Happen to Anybody. Even before critically interrogating that collective contribution, however, numerically quantifying it is a potentially complex business. If the putative Scottishness of any given play for today encompasses either the birth or adoptive nationality of one or more of its key creative personnel, then we might argue that some 50 such Scottish plays exist, including contributions from writers such as John McGrath and Alan Sharp, producers such as Margaret Matheson, and directors such as Moira Armstrong, John Mackenzie, James McTaggart, and Gavin Miller. That's not the approach that I take today, but I flag it as a possibility for further Scottish-themed investigation of the Play for Today corpus because it would respond productively to two enduringly imbalanced aspects of the existing critical literature on Scottish screen cultures and histories. The first of these imbalances is that Scottish cinema has to date provoked far more scholarly consideration than has Scottish television. And the second of the imbalances is that Scottish screen studies usually ignores the work and career trajectories of Scottish artists, however defined, when the former take those figures outside of Scotland, whether representationally, industrially, and/or institutionally speaking. But for today's purposes, however, I instead use a working definition of national origin that produces a figure of 21 Scottish Play for Todays that we might discuss and consider. And I also want to argue that that corpus can be further split into two discrete subsections. Firstly, 7 plays that were Scottish themed and/or authored, but not Scottish produced. And secondly, 14 other plays that were Scottish themed and/or authored, but produced by BBC Scotland. And I want to discuss and try and very briefly compare and contrast both those textual clusters in the remainder of this presentation. As already noted, Scottish screen studies has to date been dominated by discussion of cinema, not television. But some of the most influential critical and theoretical truisms developed within such scholarly work can, I think, be worth testing in relation to particular televisual contexts, such as the one that we're meeting here today to discuss. Two such truisms potentially apply to the Scottish plays. The first is that the most culturally pervasive and authoritative screen images of Scotland have, historically speaking, many argue, tended to be produced from outside of Scotland itself. And indeed, an initial consideration of the 21 Scottish plays seems to demonstrate that rule in action. The 7 externally produced plays all enjoyed significantly greater levels of contemporaneous attention than their locally produced counterparts. All 7 externally produced works benefited, for example, from repeat screenings subsequent to the original broadcast, whereas none of the 14 Scottish produced plays were ever repeated. In addition, 5 of the 7 externally produced Scottish plays are, or at least once were, commercially available on DVD, whereas none of their 14 BBC Scotland produced counterparts have ever been so. 5 of the 7 externally produced plays, the 4 works authored by screenwriter Peter McDougall, and also John Mackenzie's film of the 784 theatre production, The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, have also, unlike any of their BBC Scotland produced counterparts, been subject to significant acts of popular cultural memorialisation over the past decade or so. For instance, the Edinburgh International Film Festival staged a 2009 retrospective of McDougall's television work and a 2014 one of John McGrath's. McGrath and McDougall also both featured prominently in the 2-season 2012 to 2013 BBC Scotland documentary series, Watching Ourselves, 60 Years of Television in Scotland. Moreover, it's only the 7 externally produced Scottish plays that have enjoyed any sustained form of visibility within Scottish screen studies. John Cook, for example, identifies Peter McDougall as, quote, probably the most significant dedicated television playwright to have emerged from Scotland. And I picked this particular photograph of McDougall from the internet for inclusion in the presentation because it seems to me as though he himself is thinking and concluding precisely that. Elsewhere, McDougall and to a lesser extent, John McGrath are also the two most extensively discussed television writers within the two most influential scholarly monographs on Scottish film and television, Duncan Petrie's book Screening Scotland of 2000 and its 2004 companion piece, Contemporary Scottish Fictions. None, however, of the 14 BBC Scotland produced plays feature anywhere in either book. Now, these marked structural imbalances in the levels of collective attention, admiration, and recollection given over to the externally and internally produced Scottish plays, respectively brings us to a second overarching truism of Scottish screen studies that may potentially be deemed applicable to this particular body of work. And that second truism runs something like this. Many scholars don't simply assert the historical fact of the long-term cultural and industrial dominance of externally produced images of Scotland. They also attempt to diagnose and illustrate what is widely understood to be the consequence of that fact, namely that successive generations of locally based artists and locally produced work have been repeatedly compelled to inhabit and negotiate national representational terrain that's been preemptively and comprehensively landscaped by a wide range of external actors and factors, both past and present. Such an argument, a pessimistic argument, seems to animate, for example, what is perhaps the originary piece of modern Scottish television scholarship. John Cockey's pointedly titled 1982 essay, Scottish Television, What Would It Look Like?, proposes that, and I quote, it seems likely that there is a certain pressure on Scottish television producers to privilege the image of Scotland that is nationally marketable. Scottish television looks for financial and prestigious approval to London and the independent network. The marketable image of the nation is construed as the one that confirms rather than challenges the dominant discourses of Scottishness. I think that belief is worth testing and exploring in relation to the Scottish play for today's. Or to put it another way, does it matter to any significant degree that only the smaller number of externally produced Scottish plays are today remembered and revisited to any significant degree, whereas the wider body of locally produced counterparts remains effectively forgotten and inaccessible? Are the 7 externally produced Scottish plays, in fact, a reliable synecdoche for Scotland's contribution to the wider series, and for the images and understandings of Scottish culture, history, politics, and identities that the series itself either helped to create or to confirm? Did, in Cockey's terms, the internally produced plays privilege, and thus in effect repeat, the nationally marketable dominant discourses associated with their better known external peers? Or would an attempt to bring the BBC Scotland produced plays back into the light create an expanded and or revised critical understanding of this particular area of British and Scottish television histories? This presentation's remainder tries to start exploring that question. It does so by selectively sketching certain recurring characteristics of each cluster of the Scottish plays. It attempts to identify points of overlap or divergence between the two clusters and, spoiler alert, concludes that significant areas of hitherto unacknowledged divergence and diversity did and do in fact exist. So turning first to the externally produced cluster of Scottish plays. The first recurring characteristic within these to note, I think, is the pronounced collective sense of formal ambition, experimentation, and expansiveness. While Peter McDougall's debut play, 1972's Just Your Luck, is mostly studio and domestic set bound, I'd argue that it's the exception that proves the rule in relation to its peers. And even here, an active interest in alternatives to and or evolutions of naturalist and realist aesthetics is clearly visible. The play ends, for example, with an instance of blackly comic audiovisual counterpoint. The sight of a teenage mother's near catatonia while surrounded by voluble female company is accompanied by the sound of Jim Reeves crooning "Welcome to My World" on the radio. The rendering of diegetic music as a simultaneous act of extra-diegetic authorial commentary and consciousness then appears repeatedly in McDougall's subsequent plays. Elsewhere in those works, Just Another Saturday and Just a Boy's Game both use location shooting on film as a vehicle through which to experiment with diverse cinematic traditions and aesthetics. The former work adopts a cinema verite style approach to the extensive sequences depicting its central character John's participation in a large-scale orange walk through the centre of Glasgow, while the latter opens pointedly with a Glaswegian pub band covering the Rolling Stones' Paint It Black. The work then proceeds to do just that, constructing its nocturnal and violent final third in ways that feel consciously indebted to French poetic realism. More ambitiously yet, in both aesthetic and ideological terms, the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil puts its money firmly where its mouth is, arguing for the importance of radical forms of collective ownership and action by turning itself into a collectively authored work of protest and performance. The first thing we see of the 784 source play pre-opening titles, for instance, is a local audience being played into an extemporised Highland theatrical venue by a cast member bowing on his fiddle. Once inside, performers and audience encourage each other on in a raucous rendition of Jimmy Copeland's popular song, These Are My Mountains, printed lyrics held aloft on a white sheet so that none is left out. The words of Copeland's song propose that the land on which this particular performance of it takes place belong to everyone, and thus to no one person in particular. By going out of their way to involve audience members in the singing, not to mention by starting their film in this way, the Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil's formally credited author, cast and director propose a similar idea about a televisual text and performance that is at no point exclusively or straightforwardly constructed as their property. The idea that the choice between individual and communal modes of performance is an intensely political one in nature then resurfaces at numerous points and in numerous ways throughout the film's remainder. A second recurring characteristic to flag in relation to the externally produced Scottish plays is their increasingly one-sided and patriarchal gender politics over the 8-year period during which they were produced and broadcast. The first two works, chronologically speaking, in this cluster, Orkney and Just Your Luck, afford broadly equal prominence to experiences and images of feminine and masculine alienation and or repression. Orkney, a three-part portmanteau work adapted from the short stories of Orcadian writer George Mackay Brown, opens with a narrative of a highly intelligent, articulate and non-conforming male protagonist turning to alcohol as a defence against social isolation and ostracism. The work then closes with a chapter in which a similarly constructed female protagonist does pretty much the same. And in both cases, extensive use of interior monologue offers a significant additional layer of performative opportunity to actors Maurice Reeves and Hannah Gordon, respectively. Meanwhile, Just Your Luck's conspicuously even-handed depiction of feminine and masculine disappointment and domesticity, alternating between the respective unhappiness of two young adults facing the prospect of a shotgun marriage and the comparable dysfunction of their parents' respective unions, proved a profoundly unreliable indicator of how Peter McDougall's scriptwriting practice would subsequently develop. Just Another Saturday, The Elephant's Graveyard, and Just a Boy's Game all instead choose to foreground and subsequently explore their male central protagonists' respective forms of individual alienation and dysfunction through the motif of determined distancing from domestic space, experience, identification, or responsibility. While Just Another Saturday opens and closes within central character John's family home, the narrative arc makes clear that his fundamental disappointment in the pathetic example set by his pub philosopher father entails that John will, and indeed should, soon fly the nest. Elsewhere, Bunny, the doubly central protagonist of McDougall's The Elephant's Graveyard, is forced to spend his days rambling the hills outside of Greenock because he lies to his wife, who's therefore a necessarily unseen and unheard protagonist, about a non-existent job that Bunny ostensibly leaves for every morning. So self-preoccupied and isolated has Bunny thus become that his only possible walking companion is a mysterious older man, played by Billy Connolly, you can see in the slide, who may in fact be a time-travelling future version of Bunny himself. The related ideas that contemporary urban Scottish masculine experience was only authentic when isolated, or that it could only be represented authentically by being systematically isolated from all other competing considerations and discourses, perhaps finds its unintended reductio ad absurdum in Peter McDougall's first post-Play for Today work. 1981's A Sense of Freedom, again made with director John Mackenzie, depicts notorious real-life Scottish hardman Jimmy Boyle's prolonged experience of solitary confinement in prison. Turning now in the final stretch to the 14 BBC Scotland-produced plays, I'd argue that even a very kind of initial and brief surveying indicates that these texts display clear collective divergences from the above-noted recurring characteristics of their externally produced counterparts. For one thing, the locally produced Scottish plays are, with the notable exception of director Moira Armstrong's 1976 adaptation of writer Louis Grassic-Gibbon's short stories Clay, Smedham and Greenden, clearly much lower budget, and it has to be said, less formally ambitious and expansive works than their externally produced counterparts. Two of them, for example, The Bevelos, which was indeed was the first BBC Scotland produced play for today, and The Slab Boys are wholly studio and largely single set bound, a direct consequence perhaps of the fact that both works were prompt televisual adaptations of contemporarily prominent new Scottish theatrical plays. More generally, the 14 BBC Scotland plays typically avoid alternatives to or expansions of naturalist and social realist aesthetic and narrative traditions. Moreover, on the isolated occasions where they do attempt such an alternative or expansive project, it is via essentially literary or theatrical rather than audiovisual means. Antonia Fraser's Charades and Douglas Dunn's Ploughman's Share, for example, both employ multi-stranded narrative chronology, depicting, in the case of Charades, the lives of the main protagonist's forebears, or in the case of Ploughman's Share, an earlier stage in the main protagonist's life. Elsewhere, The Slab Boys foregrounds the pleasures of neo-vaudevillian performance style, with its story of disaffected but directionless 1950s male teenagers, young men for whom acts of social resistance and critical commentary are not so much ultimately futile as deliberately facile. More positively, however, the BBC Scotland plays also diverge from their externally produced counterparts in collectively exhibiting and advancing less patriarchal forms of Scottish gender politics and identities. 4, for example, of the 10 BBC Scotland plays broadcast between 1974 and 1981, Clay, Smedham and Greenden, Charades, Degree of Uncertainty, and The Good Time Girls, feature female main protagonists and foreground the distinctive and diverse natures of various forms of historical and contemporary Scottish female experience, particularly in relation to main protagonists' attempts to resist and reimagine the disappointments and restrictions of heteronormative models of sexuality and domesticity. Charades attempts to deflect latent forms of national and quasi-feudal class conflict between two metropolitan English women and their Scottish Highland servant into a narrative of psychosexual, fetishistic power games. Josie, the lead character of Degree of Uncertainty, is a single mother and mature student, caught between the distinctively class-inflected but comparably oppressive and patronising misogynies of her estranged husband and disengaged university tutors. Nancy, the main protagonist of The Good Time Girls, is an unhappily married working-class woman whose aspirations tentatively reorientate themselves towards the goal of emotional and physical authenticity rather than financial security and social respectability. These feel like potentially important or valuable points to remember come uncover, because cinema's overbearing predominance within Scottish screen studies has led many scholars to conclude that the history of 20th century Scottish screen cultures was one in which masculine, and often, as in the case of works by artists like Peter McDougall, hyper-masculine images and discourses dominated and distorted to the near total exclusion of all else. Jane Sillars and Myra MacDonald, for example, have proposed that in 20th century Scottish stream cultures, and I quote, unstable masculine identities have acted as rich metaphors for the dilemma of the stateless nation, haunted by anxieties about identity and a secure place in the world. It's not difficult to understand how and why such conclusions might be drawn when, as late as the 20th century's close, only 3 Scottish theatrical features, Margaret Tate's Blue-Black Permanent, Cokie Giedroyg's Stella Does Tricks, and Lynn Ramsay's Ratcatchers, had ever been written and directed by female artists. However, widening the frame of scholarly reference to start encompassing neglected Scottish televisual traditions, figures and works potentially starts to complicate the critical picture. In conclusion, reinserting neglected Scottish traditions, figures and works such as those contained within the BBC Scotland produced Play for Today's into broader screen histories, whether Scottish or British, cinematic, televisual or cross-platform, emphatically shouldn't result in the emergence of more quiescent or complacent critical interpretations of the chronicles in question. But this necessarily brief and admittedly speculative presentation today has tried to argue that such reinsertion would represent a timely and productive act of historical critical remembering and nuancing. For that reason, all of the Scottish works that I briefly discussed today, whether externally or internally produced, and those that I've had to pass over due to pressures of time, very much remain Plays for Today. Thank you.